Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong says there is no figure for how much is enough in Singapore's reserves, and there's no way to tell what crisis the country will run into in the future and how much it will need. He was responding to a parliamentary motion moved by the Progress Singapore Party calling for a review of policies on the budget and reserves by putting the needs of Singaporeans first instead of accumulating more for the reserves. Over 10 MPs spoke on the topic. Now, during the debate, Mr. Lee reminded the House that Singaporeans have a responsibility to protect the reserves, which he called an inheritance for future generations. He says this is an ethos that has been upheld across the aisle in Parliament.
The government is elected not just to take care of citizens today, but also to secure the future of the country. And the PAP government has always done both. But in taking care of today's citizens, we are very conscious to safeguard the interests of young people not yet voting, future citizens not yet born, and the long-term interests of Singapore.
The motion was raised by Progress Singapore Party NCMP Leong Man Wai. Now, he called for the government to review its policies on its current budget and reserve accumulation in order to put the welfare of present-day Singaporeans first while continuing to save for future generations. He also called on the government to reveal the size of its reserves.
There comes a point when the welfare of present-day Singaporeans will be hurt if we continue accumulating reserves at the same rate as we are doing now. The cost of living crisis that we are facing now, in addition to growing social inequality, increasing mental health issues, and declining total fertility rate, are examples of social ills that have resulted from our economic policies.
He was joined by members of Workers' Party, including the leader of the opposition, Pritam Singh, Mr. Gerald Giam and Mr. Louis Chua. Mr. Pritam noted that land sales contributed $1 billion a year to the reserves. And when the lease for the land expires, it will be sold in a new cycle.
In the HDB context, Singaporean HDB households are required by law to return their flats to the state for free at the end of 99 years, while the state will continue to recycle the land and collect monies from future generations of Singaporeans over and over again. The situation is the same for industrial properties where land is sold for 30 or 60 years.
MP Liang Eng Hwa asked for an amendment to the motion to safeguard reserves. Other members of Parliament also contributed to the discussion, adding that Singapore's policies on its reserves were sound and that revealing the value of reserves would not benefit Singapore.
We hope that there will never be a war on our land, and that's why we take our defence very seriously. And this is why we need to build strong reserve for any contingency, and also because of our inherent vulnerability. So it's not possible to predict or anticipate when and what the next major crisis would be and how devastating it can be. But what we can do is always to ensure that we are in a position of strength to deal with it should there be any crisis or disaster.
Their call, in my view, for the motion for the government to review and change its current budget and reserve accumulation policies is perhaps risking the long-term economic stability for our children and grandchildren. There are no free lunches in life, and we should be very, very clear what the trade-offs that are involved here.
If people know the cards you have, you're in a weaker position. So this is why it makes sense to keep that component secret. But there could be more than that. Right now, we're living in a much more unstable world. Wars could take place, economic blockades could take place. If people know the depth of your financial reserves, they will know how long you can last. So keeping some strategic ambiguity is important.
Second Finance Minister Indranee Rajah also waded in on the debate, saying it's a mistaken idea that Singapore's reserves continue to grow from the proceeds of land sales. She says the fundamental problem with all the suggestions put forth by the opposition is that when land is sold, it adds to wealth.
When we sell land, we are merely converting the land from a physical asset to a financial asset. What happens when you sell a piece of land? When you sell the land, let's say for $100 million, you get back $100 million. Are you richer? You're not. Because the land that was worth $100 million has left your hands. But what you have got is you have got $100 million. Your reserve's neutral. Your position is still $100 million. It's not new money. It's not new revenue. It's not new wealth.
Well, joining in the debate, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong challenged the opposition to take the issue to the polls and campaign on it if they truly believe that Singapore should dip more into its reserves. Mr. Lee says that the government has been looking at how to safeguard its reserves since 1984. To guard against political pressures to draw on the reserves, Singapore's founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew had mooted the idea of an elected president with the constitutional power to protect the reserves as a second key.
May I remind them that the changes they are proposing are not simply policy changes, but require amending the Constitution to draw and to spend more from past reserves, which are protected by the President. Some people say it's harder for this generation to abide by the same tight fiscal rules as before. They say that now growth is slower, the cost of living has gone up, which is true. But our forefathers who put aside the surpluses which grew into the reserves were much less well off than us. To put it bluntly, much poorer than us. Our standard of living is double or triple what our forefathers lived with.
Well, Mr. Lee says that the topic of drawing on the reserves has been heavily discussed in Parliament for years. He highlighted the example of former Workers' Party MP Low Thia Khiang, who in 2009 had questioned why the government chose to set a precedent on drawing on the reserves when it has enough savings from the current term of government to fund its support measures during the global financial crisis. Well, Mr. Lee adds that Mr. Low had later commended the government for paying the money back into the reserves.
This is how a responsible opposition conducts itself. There was a common commitment to safeguard our past reserves and a recognition, shared recognition, that they are a strategic asset only to be used for unprecedented circumstances. Now, I hear the opposition arguing that we should change the rules and draw more from reserves, and that, of course, they have no intention to raid the reserves, far from wanting to bankrupt Singapore. They say we can easily afford what they are proposing. I conclude their tune has changed.
Well, Mr. Lee says that ultimately, in a democracy like Singapore, the people will decide on big issues like managing the reserves. He challenges the opposition to campaign on the matter at the polls.
Put it up front. Say you want to touch, you want to spend. You want to shift the rules. Don't pretend that you are being just as prudent, only more kind-hearted. Campaign in the next general election on this issue. Ask voters for a mandate to form the government, change the constitution, dismantle the second lock and key. Put this squarely to the people and let them decide. The PAP will join issue with them and convince Singaporeans that our way is the right way for Singapore. And I believe Singaporeans believe us.
Well, the amended motion proposed by Bukit Panjang MP Liang Eng Hwa was eventually passed at the end of the debate, which lasted over 6 hours. 7 Workers' Party MPs recorded their dissent, along with the 2 non-constituency MPs from the Progress Singapore Party who had moved the original motion.
The ayes have it.